Welcome everybody to Shouting into the Storm, the erasure and marginalization of survivors of sexual exploitation. This is the first event in an ongoing series titled The Revolution We Need, Conversations about Sexual Exploitation, Sex Trafficking and Deep Change. And I'm honored to be joined today by some amazing survivor leaders, including Cristian Eduardo, and Melanie Thompson. And I am Beth Ribet, the Director of Repair. Before we begin the program, I want to give a brief land acknowledgement here from Los Angeles and say that Repair acknowledges the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles basis and South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatom, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, elders, and Eohinkam, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. The structure of today's event is a little different from a typical webinar or panel. We're going to be having a roundtable or collective dialogue. So there's no moderator here, it's the four of us. All four of us are survivors of sexual exploitation in some form. And we did a little bit of advanced planning to just kind of have an unscripted conversation together about the ways in which survivor voices have been marginalized and erased in contemporary spaces dealing with sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. So, and each of us is going to introduce ourselves. So I want to just, I've already mostly introduced myself, and I'll say in addition that I'm a survivor of child prostitution and pornography and a number of forms of torture. And I have been speaking publicly since I was about 42 years old. For a number of reasons, I decided I had to be a public voice about issues of sexual exploitation. One of the reasons I was able to do it was because of the kind of inspiration and model that Chris Stark has continued to embody as somebody who's been out and speaking publicly, particularly for survivors of child sexual exploitation, child prostitution, for over a quarter century now. So I just need to acknowledge and honor Chris's work and sometimes tremendous sacrifices over a long time to make it possible for more survivors to go public, and also to just really energetically welcome Melanie and Cristian as newer and unbelievably precious voices coming forward to speak about this issue. So that's my introduction, and I want to hand it off to whoever wants to go next and just introduce myself and introduce yourself, and then we can continue the conversation. Should I popcorn to somebody? Chris, you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. Your nice words, Beth. I really appreciate that. Bonjour, Indigenous Nagamo Zibi Unse Kwe. My English name is Chris Stark, and my Anishinaabe name is Singing Little River Woman. And I am in Minneapolis, Minnesota currently, and I have been doing this work in a variety of ways: grassroots organizing, speaking out, trainings, research, and writing since I was about 20 years old. And that was 4 years ago, so it hasn't been that long. Just kidding. But I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to have this conversation, and I hope that we can really continue this dialogue in a productive way, because those people who are still being harmed by this, they need us to all step forward together and do this work in a good way. So, miigwech. Melanie?
Hello, everyone. My name is Melanie Thompson. I am the Youth Outreach Coordinator at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. I am a survivor of domestic prostitution and child sex trafficking here in New York State. I've been doing advocacy work since I was 14 years old. I was actually currently still in a juvenile detention facility when I started advocacy. Thereafter, I transferred into the foster care system, where I continued to advocate for foster youth that were being exploited. And now my only job is to continue doing the same things that Chris, Beth, and Cristian are all here doing with me today. So I'm excited for this talk, this discussion. I'm happy that you guys are all here, and I'm looking forward to see what comes out of today. Cristian.
Sure. So thank you everyone who are here. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us today about this very, very important conversation, and a lot of times like a very silent conversation that we need to really acknowledge. My name is Cristian Eduardo. I'm originally from Mexico. I am a survivor of international, domestic sex and labor trafficking. I am part of the LGBTQ plus community, and I'm a person living with HIV. So to be honest, the reality is that I joined the trafficking movement because prior to that, I have been an advocate for immigrants and LGBTQ plus rights. But what I discovered on the anti-trafficking movement, it was that there were no voices representing people like me, like male survivors, like immigrant survivors, like people who are not native English speakers, and people who lack really like a citizenship, and like they're really struggling like daily with barriers over barriers. So that's what I decide, and also because I want to recognize that I'm a male. I identify as male, and we barely touch on that, like how commercial sex exploitation, the sex trade, the objectification of the bodies, or it's getting so big that it's also impacted those who created in the first place. So I think that that's very, very important, like to highlight. And so I'm super happy to be here and that we are going to start this amazing conversation.
And speakers, just a reminder, you might want to stay unmuted unless you've got hyper background noise.
So one of the first questions or issues that we wanted to talk about was the reliance on government funding or looking to the government to solve or be the primary way to solve these issues. And I'm just wondering what other people think about that.
I think that, well, if I can like start, like that's a very interesting question, you know, because I think that a lot of times within that government doesn't have nothing to do around this topic. You know, I think that a lot of times we focus a lot on nonprofits, like individuals, like funders and all this stuff. But I think that it's so interesting that federal and government fundings are not going, I think so, to the right places, and are going like, especially like big organizations that are like really replicating a lot of times this lack of sharing power and control, and re-exploiting survivors like in order to access this funding, and they are not really having a real impact like in the community. You know, I think that there is a disconnection between like advocating on the anti-trafficking world and really like serving the community. I think that those two things are different, and a lot of times we conflate them. It's like, oh, but I'm an advocate and I'm receiving funding, but I'm not giving like direct services. And it's like, okay, we understand that you are doing advocacy, but what we really need right now is like resources. What we really need is like how our communities are still struggle in the sex trade, like even coming out, and a lot of times like the organizations that are in the middle, like giving direct services, they literally is like, we just take you out of the sex trade and now on you are alone. And that's so, and that's the word. And in that way, they still are accessing like funding, but at the same time, I think that they are not really in a holistic way, like addressing like the impact of the people with lived experience.
I'm gonna add on to that. I think simultaneously, it's also very interesting because capitalism contributes to fueling the sex trade, the supply and demand, this issue of economics when it comes to bartering us as human beings, but really as commodities. And there are many officials that are higher ups or in government that are sex buyers themselves. So when we think about why the anti-trafficking movement or direct service providers that work with survivors of the sex trade are so underfunded, we have to ask ourselves the question of where is the money coming from, and why is there a lack of money being transferred from these places to our organizations. However, simultaneously, because we live under capitalism, we need these same governmental organizations to provide the funds because they're the ones that have it. They have those resources. And unfortunately, the individuals who hold the authority to provide these funds to us is, like Cristian said, in order for our organizations as nonprofits, as grassroots organizations to receive such funding, we either need to re-exploit the survivors that come through the programs, or we have to find ways to alter how we want to run our nonprofits and our programs to fit governmental guidelines that will allow for them to approve such funding, which we can get into later, but it does hinder some of the services that are available to individuals who need to access it, because you want to be able to do something for a survivor that comes through a program. However, because of X, Y, and Z guidelines we have to adhere to in order to receive the funding to stay open, we're limiting resources and access to resources for you. So it's a really contradictory and complicated topic and thing, but it is necessary, especially in the US here, for us to try to find some type of balance between complying with their guidelines and figuring out what's the best for the survivors that come through the program.
Yeah, and it seems like one thing that could happen would be for actual survivor input to try to change that higher up way that this money is defined and determined, and who gets it. We need way more money put into survivor-led organizations, and we need way more money put into culturally appropriate or culturally specific programs. And that seems like something that would require an overhaul, and the survivor voices need to be at the center of that. We see sometimes programs getting this money because they're connected. They're peers with each other. They go out to the wine bars with each other, and they get this money and they get paid, really good salaries. And I've literally had these folks coming to me who are making way more money in 1 year than I have made in 33 years of doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and be like, please tell me what to do, because they don't know anything about the issue, and it's obscene. It really is. It's totally unfair to the survivors who actually know about these issues and are doing the work. But who pays the price for that? We pay the price for that. I don't have an income. I don't have a pension, all of these things. And the biggest price that's paid is for the people who are out there and who are being hurt, and they're not receiving the services or the kind of services that will actually help them.
I want to add just one more thing about kind of the tension and contradiction that comes when we look for the US government to combat sexual exploitation. And that lies in the role of the US military in facilitating prostitution around the globe and in the United States around its bases. And there's pretty much nowhere where the US military exists and we don't see military prostitution emerging. And one of the explanations that's been given from the military hierarchy about it is that it's necessary, right? They say that so-called R&R, rest and recreation, is necessary for the military to keep functioning. That if military members can't take out their aggressions and frustrations on the body of people in systems of prostitution, that they'll turn on each other, that there'll be more eruptions of violence and lack of discipline in the military. And that to me speaks deeply to like how we need to look to the military's role itself and to military socialization. But that argument, though, even though the United States military acknowledges that prostitution is not, for the most part, legalized in the United States, they've still got a set of arguments about why they should be able to make use of it around the world and regulate it. And so then when the United States passes legislation like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which defines a set of things as criminal, but doesn't acknowledge, like, on the numbers, there's no greater global pimp than our own military, right? Our military is directly involved in pimping and trafficking. And, I say trafficking in the sense of movement across borders, not just in terms of commodities, because, we've seen, like, for instance, our military bringing, boatloads of Filipinas into the Bay during the Gulf War, because there wasn't enough localized prostitution to meet the demand from the US military. So when you're actually like shipping people in to be sexually exploited, that really, really needs to be acknowledged as a tremendous problem. And then just I think Cristian and Melanie already really addressed, a vital set of points around around the ways in which survivors are left out of those resources that could be useful. And as a researcher, as someone who has a doctorate and is in the world of academia, which is frankly not an easy thing for a survivor to do, or a healthy position to even embody, because survivors who are out tend to be unbelievably isolated in academia. But I've wound up on research teams that were grant writing, and I had my co-collaborators who I think were good, well-intentioned people who I respected. And they were writing in that the project was going to be very survivor-centered, but I was the only survivor anywhere. And I wasn't being asked about the questions that needed to be, survivor-driven. And when I would propose, we need to build into our budget room to hire and contract with survivor-led organizations to help guide this process, there was real hostility to that, because then not all of the money would be going into these research institutions, which have really turned, sex trafficking research and commercial sexual exploitation of children research into a kind of cottage industry. And we see the same dynamics in the nonprofit sector, that there's just really poor commitment to funding the work of survivors, despite the fact that nothing ever works without survivor leadership. And that our major entities at state and federal and municipal levels have to make that commitment. You don't fund research, you don't fund direct service, you don't fund advocacy, you don't fund policy campaigns, education, anything, unless you see clear evidence of funded primary survivor leadership. It's not that we can't have or don't need more allies, more expertise, but if you don't see that survivors are the center of the project, we need to stop pumping public money into it. So that's what I would add to the conversation.
Yeah, the tokenism is such a huge issue, and I have experienced it time and time again, where you bring out the survivor and you have them tell their very emotional story, and then you're like, okay, step aside now, so that those of us who are not survivors and we're the professionals, we're the ones who can think and figure out problems, and we know how things work in the world. Now we're going to sit down and figure out what to do about it. And I mean, I don't know if that sounds like an extreme statement, but it happens over and over and over again.
Absolutely.
To so many people. And also the other thing as well, talking about one of the contradictions is how much money is our federal government, our state government, and our local, my cat, sorry, I hope that's not too loud, and our local governments making off of the prostitution and trafficking of its citizens, or those people who are brought into this country. And people don't really want to talk about that, because when the money is coming from someone, then, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, right? And I think that that's such an amazing irony, perhaps, that survivors are so often sort of subtly, sometimes overtly talked about as being like, frankly, to use the word, well, they're whores. So, they're going to do this for the money. They care about the money. They're focused on the money. And it's like, you might want to look in the mirror on that one.
Absolutely. I mean, and I know we're probably like jumping all over our predetermined schedule, but in terms of tokenization, it's really interesting because for some reason throughout government systems, whether we're in Albany or DC or on a smaller scale like grassroots organization or nonprofits, there is this notion, right, that survivorship is equated with incompetency. Mm-hmm. And none of us are stupid, like just putting that straight, frankly, right? We're actually some of the smartest people that are in these organizations because we have both, we have the ability to possess both the book smarts that these professional individuals have, but we also have these innate street smarts and life skills that you need that not everybody may have if they haven't been in a life or death type of situation like we've come from. So I think that, you know, what I often find, going back to what you were saying, Beth, what I see is either they do what you were mentioning, where they just dismiss or have hostility towards survivors for suggesting to lean on survivors, or they'll take your opinion as a survivor into consideration and then brush it off. Oh yeah, we can talk about that. Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't we figure this out later? Let's talk about it over email. And it's dismissed. Or, you know, the notion of they expect you to come on a podium and cry and then pay you in a gift card, right? Because we are not seen on the same level as these same individuals who are receiving these salaries or paying their bills with actual money like the rest of us need. But we're seen as smaller scale, and all we're good for is telling a story, when we actually have a lot more talent and intelligent than that. And I've seen that play out going back to the original question. I see this playing out within higher governments as well, right? I've been approached by many task force, police task force, police departments that are working in partnership with DAs and DA offices, having human trafficking units and all types of things, where they want survivors to be consulted, but then still think, well, she's a survivor, so she's not, she's not quite up there educationally or academically. They're not on the same plane. And I think that needs to stop. That theory needs to stop. I may not have your vernacular. I don't have a PhD. I may be coming straight from the street, from a strip club, from the internet, whatever have you. But the reality is, in whatever verbiage you choose to use in that, the message is still the same. And you can be as professional as you want and have all of the credentials after your name, but if you don't know what it's like, if you don't know the experience, if you don't know what happens behind closed doors and outside of the statistics you read, then your work will never be successful or effective in actually helping survivors, if that's what you intend to do.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
Melanie, it is so true, and I think that it's so interesting because I think that especially now, like we are everyone in love about with the word accountability, and the reality is that in the non-profit, in the anti-trafficking sector, there's no accountability. Like for real, like even as you were saying, like like you know what, like I want to get compensated, and people are like, why should we compensate you? Like or things like, why are you asking for more money? Why are you asking for these things? And the worst part is that they apply for grants, for money, for fundings, and they say like, oh, this is survivor-led. This is like, we are including the voices of survivors. We are doing all this amazing thing for survivors. And the only thing that they do is like, oh, we're going to pay you like $50 like per hour. And that is survivor-led for them. And it's like, why not? Like, wait, like there's no accountability there. You are not recognizing your privilege. You are under the definition of what is professionalism for you, because as you were saying, Melanie, like we don't have like the credentials, like to prove like, oh, I'm enough for who? I'm not enough for you. I'm not enough for what? Like I'm not enough to survive. I'm not enough for what? I don't have the knowledge for what to prove that. And I think that it's really a problem of ego, lack of accountability, like a problem with capitalism, white supremacy, and people don't want to recognize it. Like how they are like harming the survivors that they are saying that they are protecting and like empowering, and where in reality they are like, oh no, I cannot pay you more because I don't know, like you don't have credentials or you don't have these things. And it's like, what credentials do you want? Like all the pain that I have suffered, like that's not enough for you. Like even like to connect with my trauma every time that you're asking me to speak, like is that not enough for you? Like is there a measure that you can, is there a way that you can measure that? And there is totally this lag, and it's like, oh, because we're going to sit down with you like an hour, like that's survivor led. And it's like, no, that is not survivor led, that is survivor re-exploitation. Actually, you are exploiting me, you're exploiting my experience, you're exploiting my pain, you're exploiting all the time that I was raped in order for you to get funding for what you want to do. And that's the reality. And people don't want to hear these things. They're like, no, but we are survivor led and we are always like supporting survivors. And no, you are not doing anything for us. You are doing all the things for you, for the name of your organization, and for your ego. Like that's the truth. Like they are really not doing anything. Like as Chris was saying, like come on, let's speak about your story and all this thing. And literally after that, they kick out like with you, like, okay, bye, like I don't
Have a
care
nice
about
day.
you. And even the compensation, I mean, like it's not even enough like to pay for a session of therapy. And it's like, man, I can just buy a chocolate with this, and how is this going to help me? Like come on, like people like react like, and there is money, there is funding in the trafficking movement. But I think that we are not seeing any of them because they like to talk about like hierarchies, like we are doing this high advocacy work, like when we are defending voices of survivors, but we in reality like survivors are here like dealing with barriers every single day, like, and they are like, no, but wait, we are doing this for you, and we are like, no, you are actually exploiting us. That's the reality.
And Christian, I think when as you speak about the complicity of these individuals and these orgs in the re-exploitation of us, I know for the sake of time, I feel like that brings us on to our next question. Talking about, I want to discuss not only the complexities of law enforcement as it pertains to the sex trade, but also the complicity of law enforcement in the sex trade. I have plenty of things I'm going to say, but I'm going to let one of you guys start that.
Oh, I think you should take it, Melanie. Get us.
Oh, okay. Because everybody, everybody who knows me knows I'm not a fan of police officers, and I have no problem saying that, you know, out loud or in public or whatever. So I've seen, I've seen law enforcement play so many different roles within the sex trade. I've seen law enforcement serve as the individuals who do quote unquote rescue missions. I'll get into that, why I'm putting that in quotes. I've seen law enforcement be my sex buyers. I've seen law enforcement claim that they're saving the runaway or homeless teen or youth. We're going to get into language a little bit later, but all of that language to me is really disgusting for a multitude of reasons. But when I often talk about police officers and law enforcement as it pertains to this issue, I understand under our current, what I call the injustice system, but I recognize that under this current system that we have in place, police officers and law enforcement are what is necessary to alleviate, I should say, the trafficking situation. Under what we have in this country, you are to call 911 or the law enforcement in the case of any of these things happening. But what do you do when you are being exploited by 911? What do you do when, and these are, and I'm so passionate about this, obviously, because this is my experience. So I'm definitely coming to you with a biased perspective. However, I remember once upon a time I was street walking. For those of you that don't know, that is exactly what you think it sounds like. It's when you're walking on the street and you're engaging in prostitution. I was 13 years old, and this is not an uncommon experience for individuals who have been in the sex trade at a young age. I was walking down the street and I flagged down a car. And one of the rules that you're groomed to do when you're, or that you're groomed into learning when you're on the street, is when the car pulls up, you are supposed to ask if you are a pimp or if you're a John. They're supposed to tell you the truth. They never do, right? Because Johns don't give a shit about us, quite frankly. And this person told me that he was neither. And when I got in the car, he drives off some miles down the road to, of course, where I'm secluded from reality, and says to me, "You asked me earlier if I was a cop. I'm definitely a cop, but if you take care of me, I'll take care of you." "Oh, you look too young to be doing this. How old are you?" I said 17. He says, "You're not 17. I said, "Okay, I'm 13. He was like, "Damn, you're young," and proceeds to go and put his hands on my breast. In that situation, what am I supposed to do? Who is the person, who is the law enforcement that I call to enforce this law on individuals that are supposed to be upholding the law? So oftentimes when you talk to survivors, when you talk to individuals who have engaged in the sex trade, and you talk about this notion of policing, right? There's one issue of policing individuals who are exploited. So I think I can speak for everybody on this call right now, when I could say that we all agree that no individual who was exploited should be criminalized for their exploitation. However, what about the individuals who are supposed to be protecting us, right? And that memory sticks in my head even 11, 10, 15 years later, because for me, that was where my distrust of 911 came from. As a small child, your mom, your dad, or at least in my experience, have taught you, if you get lost, dial 911. This is your address if you forget it. If you can't find me, find an officer, right? But in my experience as a kid, the officers only liked me because I was younger. The officers only cared about my situation because I was exotic to them. They were fetishizing my race. They were fetishizing the overgrowth of my body. They were hypersexualizing me because I was younger than their wives, right? So when I think about the complicity of law enforcement, when I think about even going back to our first question of why the government is not funding us adequately and why we're not getting these grants and things to participate or to fuel anti-trafficking efforts, is because the majority of the people who have that money are the people that are exploiting us. Those individuals don't want to give up their power. They don't want to give up the access to our bodies. They don't want to give up their right to making us a commodity. And that, you know, there's an intersection of racism, white privilege, male entitlement, all of that, sexism. They all come together when we think about this. So I get really infuriated, and you can probably hear this in the elevation of my voice as I'm hearing myself right now. You can hear that anger because I can't think about, like, I still to this day, even me being an advocate and working alongside police officers and individuals in the government, I still have this distrust. I still feel like if I were kidnapped and exploited today, I wouldn't dial 911 first. Because the first experience that I can remember of me being purchased was by a person who told me, if you do what I say, you won't go to jail. Oh, you look sad. You look like you miss your mom. You want to go back to her? I can take you if you do this. So I'm going to breathe and let you guys go ahead and jump on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Melanie, you and I have different ways that we were used in the rape industry. I was used in a very organized trafficking ring since the time that I was very young. And there were police involved in the trafficking ring. I was raped by them. I was sold to them. I was exchanged to them for various protections and various favors that the ring used. One of which was to operate in certain locations, knowing that the police would never do anything to that particular house. Look at me looking at the door. I'm all paranoid. I'm not paranoid, just kidding. So yeah, I mean, I hear you. I have never thought of the police as something that is about protection. I mean, the only thing I associate with them is being harmed and having fear and terror of them. And I have moved through a lot of that, so it's not like this huge fear. But I just want to second that. Like I don't ever think of the police as anything that's gonna protect us. And I also have had experiences as an advocate, particularly around Indigenous issues and the complicity and outright involvement and maintenance of these trafficking rings, prostitution, pornography, where the police are right there in the mix of it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
No, it's true. I mean, I totally agree with you, Mel, that it's like, even when I was trafficked, like, it never crossed my mind, like, it crossed my mind, but not like, oh my God, they are going to rescue me. Like, for immigrants, like for myself, they are like, okay, if I call the police, probably I'm going to be deported. So there is no option. Like, even that, like, walking on the street, like, and even thinking about, like, asking for help is like, oh my, like, first, I'm a gay man, like, I don't really speak, like, English very well. Like, they are going to think that I'm just here, like, stealing jobs. Like, they are going to treat me bad. Like, the other thing, that because I'm gay, they are going to assume that I'm, like, selling my body because of my own volition and choice. And it's like, how I'm going to ask for help? Like, there is no way to ask for help. And it is so true what Chris and Mel, you were saying. Like, in Mexico, it's so common to use prostitution as a means to continue perpetuating power. Like you exchange, like, bodies of people, like, for protection, for power, for money, for guns, for drugs, for everything. And I think that people barely think about this stuff, how the system that is supposed to be protecting us, like, even here in New York City, like, how police were policing, like the people just by the way they were looking and walking. And it's like, oh, you're engaged in the sexual, instead of asking, like, what is the situation that you are going through? It's like, no, you are committing a crime. And a lot of times they are the buyers, and there is this lack of accountability on buyers, because all policies and legislation are always, like, victim blaming, like, oh, the people engaged on the sex trade are the ones who blame because they choose to do this. They are the ones who are deciding to engage on this, when in reality is all these sex buyers, like law enforcement, judges, like all these people with power that are really feeling this, and that are really like create, like protecting all the system that is like, oh my God, but you know what, like the judge is it's a buyer, and this, they have this problem, so let them go, or things like that. And we need to really start like talking about this, like how law enforcement is perpetuating like the sex trade, like sexual exploitation in all our communities, and how instead of being like a symbol of protection, like a symbol that oh, you are going to help me, it's more like, no, actually, like you are going to exploit me if I reach out to you.
I'm so grateful to everybody for raising all of this. And Melanie, that was just a ferocious start. Thank you. The one piece I want to add is that I also want folks to understand how much anti-trafficking work, whether it's government sponsored or emerging out of the nonprofit sector, is focused on trying to solve sexual exploitation using solutions that are grounded in criminal justice. And I think that that's an enormous mistake. One reason is that criminal justice systems won't work to stop sexual exploitation when too many police are engaged in sexual exploitation. They'll never be able to build trust with anybody. But even if that problem were cleared up, one of the things that we have to understand is that, don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing against accountability to pimps, to traffickers, to sex buyers. But the core fundamental causes of sexual exploitation aren't addressed through criminalization. So we have to deal with poverty, we have to deal with racism, we have to deal with gender inequity at the core. And not all of, but most of the resources that are geared towards combating sexual exploitation need to start to be channeled into combating the vulnerability of children, of adult women, of LGBTQ folks, and of everybody who's economically vulnerable. And of course, that's disproportionately and constantly BIPOC communities, right? And immigrants and refugees. So we have to start working on solutions that make people less vulnerable to being turned into commodities. When we do that, we're going to start to see like concrete and radical and dramatic changes. If we just, every time that there's funding or attention or energy, we just think about, well, what other laws can we pass that will focus on criminalization? Whether it's targeted at the survivors or at the perpetrators, what I'm saying is we need to redivert 80 to 90% of that money into looking at policy solutions that alleviate poverty, that make it so that folks have real resources, and that support and benefit folks who have been exploited, so that we're able to engage in systems to change, so that we're able to do more than survive. So that's what I would add.
Yeah.
No, just go, Chris.
Oh, I was just going to say, along with that, there has to be some kind of accountability. There has to be something that goes after these perpetrators. There to stop raising our boys and to stop the demand, because like we can put women in, if women want to go into housing, and we can provide working jobs for them, but the fact of the matter is that there are these violent perpetrators, and there's a demand, and they're going to fill their demand. So we have to pay attention to the demand piece as well.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I think that a lot of times when we are talking about solutions, we forget about that, like how accountability looks like and how the role of the man and buyers like play on the sex trade. I think that we often minimize that. But I want to talk a little bit more about what Beth was saying, that about solutions and all these things. And she mentioned like equity, and that's so interesting for me because as part of the LGBTQ plus community, to be honest, I don't see representation on the anti-trafficking movement. What I have been seeing actually, it's a lot of homophobia, transphobia, like biphobia, and that's the reality. Like a lot of nonprofit organizations are rooted in transphobia, are rooted in homophobia. They don't even understand like what are the barriers or the meaning of being part of the LGBT community, or why are we vulnerable. And I think that this is just creating friction and more friction and more friction. And that's why a lot of times the anti-trafficking movement looks like, oh, but you are against sex, or you are not supporting the LGBTQ plus community and all that stuff. And in reality, like, sadly, a lot of times people in power, they are homophobic, they are transphobic, they don't really understand what is the meaning of being gay, what is the meaning of being lesbian, what is the meaning of being a trans woman, a trans man, what is the meaning of non-binary. For them, this is just like something created out of the nothing, and they really don't care. Like, they really don't care. And if we don't start working on create like inclusive spaces, and when I say inclusive spaces, that doesn't mean that me as part of the LGBT community, me going educating every single one of you. That means that you are going to do the work to understand what are the barriers, what is the meaning of being LGBTQ plus, what is the barriers, what is the work that you have been doing, how is totally connected, like with the battle that we are doing all together, like to showing the rights for all, and that we are part of a society that are being oppressed. Like, we are being oppressed. We are just like 5% of the population here in the United States, and people think that gay people are invading like all spaces, and that we are like. And the other thing, I think that there is a misunderstanding about what it means to be part of the LGBT community. I think that a lot of times people think that we are immune to sexual violence, that we cannot be raped, that the only worthiness that we have is like our bodies. And that's not the reality. Like, we are human beings. But I would like to hear more about like from you, like, because I know that you have been a little bit more time than me in the anti-trafficking world. I would like to hear, what do you think about all these things, like homophobia, transphobia, like in the movement?
Me? Oh.
I want to jump in on that one. So I've been an out lesbian since I was pretty young, about 20 years old. And I still remember sort of looking for, still being in a ton of shock and hardly able to think about some of the things that I'd gone through as a kid, and looking to spaces like women's studies and gender studies and feminism, and queer communities, trying to find my allies, trying to also just find clarity, like what was a movement that I could be part of. And I found that there was such a thing as like anti-prostitution feminism, and that there were some things within it that were incredibly life-affirming and important to me, including at least a few at that point, even in the 1990s, survivor narratives coming from folks like Maya Angelou and Andrea Dworkin. But I also remember the first time I read an essay by an Australian anti-prostitution feminist named Sheila Jeffries, and the title of the essay was F to M, Transsexualism and Grief. And there was a phrase in that essay that just really stunned me. And she referred to people who are F to M, transgender, as, quote, surgical social climbers, close quote. And she packaged that like just deep hostility in her argument that feminists needed to organize against trans people as part of her anti-prostitution feminism. And I just remember sort of this like really gut sick, like I felt it in my belly, and I felt sort of trembly, thinking, oh my God, if this is what's coming from the people who are saying they're our allies, the survivors, if these people are out there speaking for us and saying that they're anti-transgender, when anybody who's been in systems of prostitution for 2 minutes knows that these are deeply transphobic spaces, that our transphobic community members are dying and are experiencing some of just the worst manifestations of abuse that we can imagine. And then we've got these people out there speaking for us, saying we need to mobilize against trans folk, deciding which survivors are worthy victims. And I think we need to deal with the fact that that just deep, hostility to trans people has been too painfully built into the history of anti-prostitution and anti-trafficking work. We've got to weed that out and say, as survivors, we have to say as loudly as possible, no, we're not going to tolerate that. You cannot choose which of us have lives worth saving, which of us have experiences worth recognizing, which of us are good victims. right? So I just really want to say as loudly as possible that there's no such thing as a viable approach to combating sexual exploitation that isn't thoroughly inclusive and committed to the liberation of all LGBTQ people. And I'm not, as a survivor, accepting anything else. And I'm going to name names. I'm going to like call out people like Sheila Jeffries and say, you don't represent me. And I don't do that very often. I'm not about naming the names of people and saying what they're doing wrong. But when someone says something like that, refers to trans people as surgical social climbers, I'm sorry to even repeat the phrase, but we need to take that in, right? That needs to be named, and we need to say, no, that's not our movement.
And I also think that, there's a lot of hesitancy and fear to talk about these issues, as Cristian said, the homophobia and transphobia that exists in our culture and in the people, therefore many of the people doing this work. And there's a lot of fear because a lot of the people doing this work are women. And there's a fear that these straight women have specifically around lesbians and around being viewed as a lesbian, as a feminist, as a man hater, all these kinds of things. And it's been really difficult 30 years for me doing this work as a lesbian, and I knew I was a lesbian when I was really young. And the kinds of things that they started to do to me when I was pre-adolescent, I guess, once they kind of figured out that I wasn't in a stage, has really messed up my life. The amount of hatred that they then added on to the amount of hatred they already, beat into me and raped into me when they were realizing that I was a lesbian, has made it very, very difficult for me in my life and in doing this work as well. And people really need to confront that. I mean, I've had many experiences like the rest of you have probably had to, of, having someone read my biography before I'm gonna do a day-long presentation and stop and look like they're gonna literally throw up when she has to say the word lesbian in my bio. It just, thing after thing after thing like that around the LGBTQ community. And not all conservative Christians, from my understanding anyway, my movement into understanding around conservative Christians are explicitly homophobic and transphobic, but there's a significant amount of that. And the conservative Christian movement has really gained a lot of footing around this issue. And their homophobia and transphobia is unacceptable. We had an experience here in the Twin Cities with that, where this organization tried to veil their connections, and they did a huge public fundraising, and they don't even do this work. And they raised thousands and thousands of dollars from people thinking that they were giving their money to some good organization. And I did all this research on them, and they have all of these connections to these extreme conservative Christian organizations, Christian churches that say on their website, if you're a homosexual, you're going to hell. We don't allow homosexuals in our organizations, and so on and so on. So, the homophobia and transphobia piece, it's all over. It's in all different groups. And straight people really need to work on that. And then they need to stand up for us in doing this work. And one more thing, I wanted to say too, is also when I was starting when I was 12, my father would show me pornography and force me to watch the pornography. Lesbian pornography is the biggest genre in pornography. And he would force me to watch this lesbian pornography of a so-called lesbian sexually abusing the other woman in the pornography. So, these kinds of attitudes permeate these industries, and they harm real people, such as and the rest of us on this panel.
And I think I just want to add to all of that. I love, Chris, that I don't love that this happened, but I love that you brought up, the fact that when people read your bio, they make this face like they want to vomit when they say lesbian. And I really want to address this because we are aware, most of us are aware, right, of the outward facing homophobia, transphobia, like the conservative Christians and the right, where they're like, we don't support trans people or things like that. We are, that's out in the open, and we see that. What I want to talk about is what I've noticed over the last 10 years, more so in maybe the last 6 or so years, as more of the trans population is gaining momentum in their movements and, you know, talking about trans rights. The microaggressions that I see in these organizations when they talk about trans people, and we don't call it out, we don't see it sometimes, but we see the people that are outward with their transphobia. But then there's people in organizations that are like, you know, we're not transphobic. But then when you're having a discussion about that, they'll be like, you know, he, she, they, it, whatever they want to be. Or they say, you know, he, she, they, them, roll their eyes, shake their head. Those are the things that also contribute to a transphobic narrative. And I think a lot of individuals in this movement, you know, because they're not saying like hate speeches to trans people in their face, they equate that with not being transphobic. And that's completely false. There are other ways to show that there are other ways that I can tell that you're transphobic or homophobic or biphobic, right? You don't need to do a raid on the Capitol in DC to show me that you're racist. I can experience microaggressions at work from you, you know, not wanting to be next to me if I'm microwaving something for lunch, or there's all these other little things that point out racism, right? It's the same with transphobia and homophobia. And I've seen it a lot where organizations that everybody, like Cristian was saying, we're so obsessed with trying to be the inclusive, safe space that, you know, they think because they put their pronouns after their name, that makes them inclusive. That's not what makes you inclusive. Yes, it shows to somebody that doesn't know you, hey, maybe this person has a little bit more knowledge and is less ignorant on the issue. But yes, it's absolutely performative, right? You can put she, her, she, they, he, him, he, they, whatever after your name. But then if a trans person or somebody that's gender nonconforming or a person with trans experience comes to your organization for help and services, everybody's tiptoeing around as if that person is the elephant in the room. That's an issue. You can have your personal belief systems. If you don't support this, that's your business. I can't read your mind. But if you're going to be an organization that is providing direct services to folks, and you are focusing on trying to be an inclusive space, especially when the trans population specifically makes up over 45% of individuals that are exploited in the system of prostitution, then we absolutely need to address how you need to separate your personal belief system from the work that you do if you're claiming to give services to the community. This has nothing to do with what you say to yourself when you go to bed, what you say to your husbands or your wives or your friends when you're home. But if you're providing services to all of the individuals that are exploited within the system, then you need to be privy to that, educate yourself, and know how to keep your personal opinion out of your workplace.
And I'll even try to push that further. I don't think there is such a thing as keeping your personal opinion out. I think if you can't get aligned, you know, with a basic non-discriminatory approach to thinking about LGBT inclusion, if you don't believe that, I don't know how you could be effective. I don't know how you really could compartmentalize that. But yeah, at the very least, you'd have to try. I think we need people, you know, in positions of responsibility, in positions to educate, who have a commitment to, again, you know, at the very barest minimum, like inclusive human rights concepts. I think if you can't at least get there, then this isn't the right job for you, and you shouldn't be taking money and space in order to be doing this work.
Absolutely. And I know that we're like moving into different topics and we're saving questions for the end. But I see Taina just wrote a question that relates to what we're talking about right now. Cristian, if you can see that, can we speak about Black and brown trans and gender nonconforming spokespeople calling for full decrim of prostitution, and how can we support trans and gender nonconforming populations who are abolitionists? You want to go first?
Yes, of course. To be honest, like, okay, this is more complex than it looks like. The first thing is that as a movement, we are completely in our personal beliefs with what is really happening in reality. Like, as Chris say, like, religion is one of the main facts. Like, I cannot remember like even the times that I have been like someone being uncomfortable because I'm gay or because I'm living with HIV and all this stuff. And that's my reality. And for all the people who are hearing like right now this, if you're getting uncomfortable, it's not my problem. It is your problem because you are the one who hasn't educated yourself enough like to really understand this. And this is not about like me making everyone gay, everyone lesbian, and everyone transgender. That's something that you were born with. That's nothing to do about yourself. Like if you're having doubts, like the reality is that that is your problem. Like I respect everyone, but that is not my problem. The reality, like I'm gay, I deserve rights, I deserve respect, love, and compassion, and you do deserve the same. So if you really are getting uncomfortable about this, ask yourself why. Like probably because you are transphobic, probably you are homophobic, probably because now we are like really pinching on like, oh my god, I know what am I, but I don't want to recognize it. So ask yourself like why am I feeling uncomfortable around this conversation? And the other part is that right now the anti-trafficking movement, I think that it's having like a clash within the LGBT community because I think that media, because that's the reality, media, people of power and people in control are the ones who are actually tokenizing the people in the LGBT community to portray that we are all supporting the narrative of full decriminalization. And that is not the reality. The reality is that I'm standing here like, and everyone know I'm part of the LGBT community. I'm an advocate for the LGBT community. And even that I oppose full decriminalization. Why? Because I'm using my experience and I'm like reaching out like this issue with my lens of as an immigrant, as a person living with HIV, and the reality is that our community, it has been like marginalized for years. It has been ignored. There are no services for us because of transphobia and homophobia in all spaces. Like there is no safe space for us to work. There is no access to education. There is no access to skill for labor. Like forget about like having a safe space, even to sleep, even to eat. Like that is the reality. So what is happening is that my community has been cornered to being seen as that the only worthiness that we have is our bodies. And that's the reality. That is the only way that we have been surviving. So when someone came and say like, yes, we are supporting you, like we believe on you, like you are not survivor, like sexual exploitation is not real, like sex trafficking is not real, that is not happening, like and people with lived experience are still marginalized with any other option that's selling their bodies, of course they are going to say, yes, let's full decriminalize this system that is allowing me to survive. And the reality is that we have been like the guilty ones because of our homophobia, our transphobia. We don't have been like serving this community. We have been cutting resources. We have been ignoring them. And that's why they have been cornered on the sector. And that's the reality. So our work really right now is to really understand this, acknowledge our privilege, and because you don't support full decriminalization, that doesn't mean that you are going to become homophobic or transphobic. I'm a gay man. I'm not transphobic. I'm not homophobic. Like I always fighting for the LGBTQ plus right, and I support the equality model. Why? Because I acknowledge that buyers, that people like brothel owners, like people with power, people with money, even if they are part of my community, they are harming my community because they are commodifying our bodies, because they are accessing our bodies, because we are not any more than genitalia for society, and that's the reality. LGBTQ plus people, we are not more than genitalia. We are not more than sexual pleasure. Like forget about us like having being on political spaces and being doctors, like whatever you want. Like no, society has been teaching us and has been forcing us to believe that the only thing that we can do is selling our body, is giving like access to our genitalia, and that's the best that we can do. And we all together need to work on breaking down this like homophobia, this transphobia, this xenophobia, this machismo, this patriarchy that is fueling the system, and to really start offering like programs, services, resources tailored for the LGBTQ plus community. We can do this, and this is the really time. This is a really big call right now. Like no, let open your eyes. Like your homophobia, your transphobia is closing the doors for you. You, as Beth say, like you are not who to decide who is the one to receive the services. So for real, like there's nothing wrong to support the LGBT community, and there's nothing wrong if you are not okay with full decriminalization. That can coexist and it's real, and I'm here like, no, let's support together the equality model. Let's support together like the accountability over buyers, brothel owners, all these people that are exploiting my community, all these people that are like profiting from our genitalia. That's the reality.
And so with this, I know we're in the interest of time. So just before I move on to the next question, I just wanted to add that when we think about the trans population, but really anybody, but the trans population specifically, when we think about the spokespeople for them that are advocating for full decriminalization, what we need to do is ask ourselves why they're advocating for that. There's a big misconception. I think a lot of people are riding the train of full decriminalization of the sex trade because they think that that is the best way to help decriminalize the people that are exploited. There is another alternative, which I'm sure we'll get into at the end, but because a lot of people don't do the homework or ask the question beyond the surface. They're like, oh, if this person says that's what they want to do, that's what they want to do. But they don't actually get into why they feel like that's something that they need to do. And I think we'll address that in a second. So with that, I'm going to open with the next question about academia. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the education that we get in women and gender studies courses. Let's talk about the education that we're getting around the issue of prostitution. Why is it that that so much of academia doesn't understand our perspective? Why is it that this narrative of sex work is pushed onto us in our classes?
Because I would like to start like, because literally they are silencing survivors. Because for people and for society survivors, we are all these little persons that we are like mental health problems, that we have trauma in ourselves, that we don't have like the credentials, that so we are not to trust to be included in academia. Like they are doing their research, like funded by as we were saying in the beginning, like, oh, in order for me to fund you, you need to use the narrative of sex work or those things. A lot of times all these people who are like calling themselves experts on the sex trade, that are writing like articles, books, and all these things, they don't even sit down with survivors like us. They don't even sit down with the people who have experienced it and educate them, because that's the reality. Like we need to educate like the people. Is like, no, actually when you are using on academia like sex work is work, what you're forcing me is like to silence my rape, silence my pain, silence like the sexual violence that is really happening in prostitution. And that's so infuriating, because I think that it's so hard, because these people, they cannot acknowledge their privilege. They cannot acknowledge how they privileged they are, and how their imposition of their ideas like are actually like impacting like survivor like us.
So I've spent my adult life in academia, in other places too, but I've been doing this a long time. And one of the things that I think is true is that my peers and my colleagues in academia seem to be very sure that they've mostly got the sex industries figured out, that they know the right way to talk about it, that they know the right positions to take. And that makes it extremely difficult for survivors to be in conversation and take up space. So Melanie raised the term sex work, and I've just repeated it. And I want to say that it gives me the trembles. I hate that language so much. And I react to it in a more physical, negative way than if you said whore, right? Or slut, or any of the other pejorative words that are directed against us, those of us who've been in systems of prostitution. And I react so negatively to those words because I understand enough about its history. I understand that that term was introduced in part to sort of neutralize critiques of mass sexual exploitation, to reframe people's experiences of being commodities as if we were simply labor. And we can talk about how labor is a commodity under capitalism, but there's a difference. There's a huge difference. And I want to say how deeply alienating that language and that frame and its pervasiveness, and not just academia, but in journalism now and in the United Nations, right, is, as a toddler who was getting tortured and raped and drugged, and sometimes almost killed. The problem wasn't that I didn't have a labor union. The problem was that I was getting tortured and raped and almost killed. There's no condition of work in which that kind of act can be transformed. And I think one of the things that, and as somebody who was in the sex trade as a little kid, right? I was too young to ever get arrested, and I might not have been anyway because I have white privilege. But one of the things folks have said when I sort of raise this critique is, well, okay, but of course, children. And yet that doesn't seem to stop folks from using language like child sex workers, which I see in print and publication and in advocacy. So I want to say that's not my language. I never chose it. And the people who popularized it weren't coming organically from within our movements. They were never representing survivors of sexual exploitation. And at least a fair number, I'm not saying all of them, were middle-aged white women who had a stake, an economic stake in other people being sexually exploited because they had transitioned into the role of pimping or making pornography and were profiting from this industry. So what I'd want to say to my colleagues in gender and women's studies is, why didn't we, as this language emerged, start to have a conversation about whiteness and white women and pimping? Why didn't we talk about that? The fact that we don't all have the same stakes in terms of racial or economic privilege or our relationships to gender in the sex industries. Why didn't we have that conversation? Why did you take the most privileged possible language, the perspective of people who are profiting from and wanting to maintain this, and take it as representative of our collective experiences? And there are enough people who've entered this industry as an adult and have come out and said, I was tortured, I was abused, I was raped. I'm not going to draw a divide and say, well, it's different, so different from me because I was a child. The bottom line is that these are violent industries, and they prey on destruction. And what I find is that if I do the hard work of, first of all, having to come out, so one minute I'm a professor and the next second I say that I was a kid who was tortured, and people almost don't know how to think about that in academia. Like, you can't be both. You can't be a survivor who has a PhD. That's like being a fish who can fly. It's just impossible, right? I'm like, no, I did it. Sometimes I was hooked up to respiratory equipment while I was writing my dissertation, and it's not easy to finish graduate school with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but survivors are amazing effing people. And a lot of us have accomplished things, and we've got places. And so I'm here, I'm in this conversation, and it's like people do not know what to do with that. And they just are like, but we know this is the truth, right? The people in the sex trade don't want it to be stigmatized. They want it to be, I'm like, who is they? Who have you talked to? And almost every time I have a conversation with an academic, they never had a conversation with any of us ever. But they're so sure because their colleagues have created a body of literature that say this is our truth, the people who are speaking for us. And so this is some of the damage of having like research dollars pouring out and never going through survivor organizations. This is some of the damage about the fact that it's still true, even in fields like LGBTQ studies and gender studies, and at least some sectors of ethnic studies, and in mainstream disciplines like sociology and anthropology and law and psychology, that it's okay to speak for people. And once somebody has done that and declared what we think, or some researcher went out, paid $15 to survivors who had been sexually exploited in the last 15 minutes, quoted some of them saying, I'm fine, and then decided we're all okay, right? From that, and generalized that. So like the lack of commitment to, basic trauma-informed protocols and research, the willingness to define other people without any accountability back for us. And then those of us who enter academia, it's like, it's hard, emotional, and embodied work to then represent, to be present, and to talk about talk against what everybody is so sure of, when there's only a handful of us there to intervene at all. Like when Melanie started talking about women's studies, I was just like, thank you. Thank you.
I'm currently a women and gender studies major in my undergrad. And I cannot tell you. I mean, I always expect this when I register myself for my classes. Um, I was in the foster care system because of my arrest from the sex trade, and I'm a survivor of prostitution. I always know I'm either going to be the only one or one of two people in the class that have those experiences. And it is so frustrating, like you said, Beth, to have to sit in the back of my class when there are these teachers who have all these credentials that, you know, nobody knows everything, but they swear on the subject they're teaching that they are the professors at that. To hear them explain to me how sex work is a choice. And honestly, I think, you know, like how Cristian was saying in the beginning, that everybody loves the term accountability now. Everybody also loves the term progressive or progressiveness. Everybody's trying to ride this train. Everybody, you know, our generation now is in this woke era where everybody is educating themselves on all of these social justice issues, and everybody wants to feel like they're, you know, propelling the world in the right direction, right? But sex work, and I hate to keep giving this terminology validity by saying it, but the term was coined to mask the inherent harms of prostitution, and that's just what it is. Interestingly enough, the term sex work was created because prostitution was just too vulgar, yet we still call people in prostitution prostitutes. Another word that I absolutely cannot stand. But when I'm in classes, I'm sitting in these classes having a teacher tell me that people love to do this, and this is what pays their tuition, and this is how they get through school, and this is how they survive, because this is something that, you know, if it wasn't for sex work, they wouldn't have been XYZ, or they wouldn't have had this, or they wouldn't have had that. The reality is, I'm not gonna, and I always say this, I'm never going to negate somebody's story. If somebody came up to me right now and said to me, you know what, Melanie, this is something that I love doing and I enjoyed, and I did this by my choice, okay, I'm gonna converse with you, because at the end of the day, whether you identify as a sex worker and I identify as a survivor of prostitution, regardless, the marginalization and the harms are still the same. But what I am gonna do, right, I'm not gonna tell you that you're wrong if that's how you self-identify. But what I am gonna do is have this conversation about this, and we're going to compare our commonalities about the harms that we've experienced, because I guarantee you over 98% of the individuals of the population that are in the sex trade have experienced violence at the hands of either their pimp, their trafficker, or a sex buyer. There's less than 2% of the individuals in the population of people in prostitution that are there by absolute choice. And I think this segues into my language narrative, right? But the reason that so many people are writing the full decriminalization of the sex trade wave, the reason so many people are talking about this narrative, this term sex work, both in academia and out of academia, is this notion of choice. They separate sex trafficking victims from sex workers, right? They say, and this is, I still, to this day, it baffles me that our society still does this, right? We talk about, when we think about sex trafficking, we think about children that are smuggled in white vans across the country, right? We think about movies like Taken. Yes, this is one depiction of what trafficking may look like, but it is not the only. And we keep focusing on that. I wasn't thrown into the back of a white van, right? And of course, universally, when we think about trafficking, we think about children under 18. So majority of the time, our society collectively recognizes that that's wrong. But the minute that 17-year-old child turns 18, now all of a sudden they're a consensual sex worker. The reality is, people don't just wake up and say, my dream job is to be in prostitution. That's not the reality for any of us, right? The reality is that the system of prostitution, because it is a system, it is not an individualized choice. The system of prostitution, which is oppressive, thrives on other oppressive systems, namely patriarchy, capitalism, and misogyny. And when you recognize prostitution as a system rather than a choice, you'll recognize that the system of prostitution targets vulnerable and marginalized populations, i.e. Black and brown individuals, women, girls, children, trans-identifying folks, anybody on the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, anybody with a prior sexual abuse history, from if you're familial trafficking, your parents or your grandparents or your family, anybody who has a foster care background, anybody living in poverty, right? So when you think about all of those different risk factors, and there's others, I can keep going on and on with that, but when you think about all of those prior risk factors into somebody becoming vulnerable and susceptible to being lured or engaging in the system of prostitution, when you speak to that person that says sex work is work, ask them, if they don't check off any of those risk factors? Because I guarantee you the majority of the time, the answer is going to be no. They will be checking off at least one of those boxes. So whether or not you want to use this language to make prostitution sound pretty, the reality is prostitution isn't pretty. The reality is sex buyers are harmful. Yeah, maybe you have one or two that don't actually have a knife to your throat. That doesn't mean that them putting money on your body and treating you as a commodity is not just as harmful. And I think that's the problem. We think about choice and we think about pimps. We're thinking about people that are handcuffing you or tying you up in ropes or putting guns to your head. That's not the only way to be harmful. Just the mere existence of commodifying me is harmful in and of itself. And when you think about it, you did not make the choice to be in prostitution. Your lack of resource, your vulnerability, your marginalization, your circumstance, those are the things that made that choice for you. You understand? And language definitely matters around this issue. So I know like we're short on time and I can keep going on that, but definitely.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I wanted to say that sort of bringing in the academic piece again is the way that they also silence us and keep us out of the conversation and keep us out of the pages on the books. And an example of that was that I submitted a proposal to the Palgrave International Human Trafficking academic publication. And one of the editors on that, they're all academic folks, totally scoffed at me. I mean, just sent this like condescending message back to me saying that she would not accept my proposal because it was absurd that I would say that Christopher Columbus was a sex trafficker and that I essentially just wasn't smart enough to understand what people with PhDs understand. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't ever pursue a PhD is because I can't stand the culture. And I can't stand being treated like that. And I can't stand the arrogance and the elitist attitudes of so many of those people in that culture. But anyway, so I just was like whatever, I don't need this. And I walked away from it. And then the overall editor of the collection contacted me and said, I'm really sorry about that. Would you consider this? And I had like 2 months to pull together all this research on the trafficking and prostitution and sexual exploitation of Indigenous women. And, when we're talking about this colonization and the formation of this country, the United States of America, was done off of the backs and with the land that was, largely taken from Indigenous people. Christopher Columbus and his men went around looking for 9 and 10-year-old girls to sell. He was involved in the slave trade of the Taino people back to the Mediterranean slave market. Between 2.5 and 5 million Indigenous people were enslaved on this. And a historian with a PhD, who's much smarter than I am, apparently, he says what I could say and wouldn't really be listened to, but he says that this the enslavement of Indigenous people is antecedent to the current sex trafficking and prostitution that we're seeing now on this land. And none of my research, would have come at a much later time. If this other academic hadn't stepped in and made this space for me to do this work and then uncover all of this. And I want to jump forward just a minute and a half up to Duluth, Minnesota. And I did some quote unquote primary research as a graduate student with Indigenous women who have been prostituted and sex trafficked out on the port in the Duluth area. And those women disappear. A lot of those women disappeared on those ships. Women, boys, girls, babies brought out and trafficked on those ships, brought to other countries on those ships. Other Indigenous women brought into the Duluth port on those ships. And so you have 100, 150, 200, and so on years of this kind of business of rape set up in this country, up in that area. And it continues today. The history doesn't recycle for Indigenous people around sex trafficking in particular. History's just never stopped. And it's the same actors, the same institutions conducting the same kinds of violence and exploitation against Indigenous people, extractive industries, the government, corporations, and also to a lesser degree now, churches as well. But the churches were really central to that in the beginning. I'm gonna wrap up real quick here. So one of the things that I did is I looked at the Duluth police ledgers from the 1800s. And what they would do is they would list the name of the woman arrested, and then it would say her race, Indian, and then it would say her occupation, whore. So this idea that the selling of people to others for rape and other forms of sexual exploitation, that this is some kind of progressive idea, and that calling it sex work is some kind of new progressive thing that began in the 70s. This is a continuation of Christopher Columbus. It's a continuation of those kinds of dynamics, and it's a continuation of the red light districts and also the Duluth police force looking at Indigenous women being in the occupation of being a whore. So when people want to support sex work and they want to support, pro-prostitution and a full decriminalization, ask them, if you're so progressive and you're so interested in connecting all the dots around colonialism and around racism and around poverty and starvation and theft of land, go back and look at those histories of that, and then come back and talk to us about how this is some kind of new progressive wave of empowerment. This is the history of this country, and the history of this country began with the sex trafficking of Indigenous girls and women.
Thank you, Chris. That's incredible. I want to take us next into thinking a little bit about, and we don't have a lot of time left, so we've got to finish up the conversation soon, but I just want to really acknowledge that again, Chris. I think that to start to address sexual violence at its roots, we have to deal with the fact that its roots are in colonization and in slavery in the United States. I want to talk about the left. And I really want to address the way in which, not just in academia, but the ways in which it's become really normal in progressive and left-wing spaces. And just an acknowledgement of Melanie's critique of the trendiness of being progressive right now. That the American Civil Liberties Union, the Amnesty International, UN Women, right? That a lot of spaces that are not the government and that are recognized as committed in some way to human rights, though each of those entities has their own sometimes publicized struggles over racism and over voice and over their relationship to Indigenous peoples. One of the things that we've seen is that it's become normal in the left, and again, not just confined to academic left, like women's studies and gender studies and queer studies, to speak for survivors of sexual exploitation, or to outright erase us, to talk about systems of prostitution as if sex trafficking or sexual exploitation is just an unusual or aberrant phenomenon. And I think we need to talk about that, because one of the things it does is leave survivor activists in an extremely marginalized place. So it's very hard for us to be able to look to feminist and anti-racist and abolitionist relative to criminal justice organizations for allies, at least to the extent we should. On many issues, when someone starts showing their feminism or their anti-racism, I'm like, this is great and I'm excited to hear that, and yet I have this wariness. I'm waiting to see where they're going to come down or what's going to happen if we start to talk about sexual exploitation. And there's a painful irony about that, because by far the most just violent and extreme forms of oppression that I've experienced, being used as a toddler in pornography, being whipped, being partially drowned, going through forms of torture I won't talk about in public spaces. Like, these are the worst things that have ever happened to me. And so the fact that I never know whether people who are progressive are going to turn out to be allies or not, or even be willing to have a meaningful dialogue, that's really hard. So I want to open that up to the group to talk about.
Sorry, I'm sitting here taken aback by, just reflecting on my experiences in the sex trade, and doing this work for any one of us on this call, especially as people who have lived experience. This is tiring work, right? This is draining to constantly have to try to explain to people how harmful it is, right? And explain to people that what they see when they walk down the street and somebody may not be what they actually see. I can't stress enough what makes somebody vulnerable and susceptible to the sex trade, right? We often hear this idea of prostitution being a job like any other. We often hear that people talk about, prostitution is the oldest profession, when really it's the oldest oppression. And we don't talk about this, right? We can't consider it a job if there's no gainful employment. We can't consider it a job when there are no benefits. We can't consider it a job when it's only based off of the fetishization of somebody else's body, right? No other job asks you to have certain physical credentials, your body, how you look, whether you're Black or anything like that. No other jobs have you do that. Majority of these jobs don't result in rectal or vaginal prolapse, the inability to conceive, PTSD, right? So when I think about these things, and I think about people raping me with Corona bottles, and people making me bark like a dog because they knew that I had no money and they had it. Or when people tell me to get on my knees and they wave $100 bill in front of me because they knew that I lacked that resource. I could never consider that work. And whether or not I had a pimp or didn't have a pimp, it does not negate the fact that somebody else decided that their money was going to dictate what I did, who I did it with, and where I did it. Nothing about that is empowering. Nothing about that equals or equates to choice. Nothing about that equates job in my mind. And I don't see it like that. And I recognize that there are many of us that have lived experience that may not see eye to eye on that. And whether or not you identify it as a job or give it validity under capitalism, the reality is whether you say that you're doing this by choice and this was your own, this is what paid your bills, it proves my point that the reason prostitution seems like a viable option to marginalized folks is because we're marginalized. When you say I needed to engage in prostitution, whether you say I needed to engage in sex work to pay XYZ, it shows the marginalization, it shows the lack of resource, it shows the poverty, it shows that you have no other choices if it weren't for this. So it proves my point that the system of prostitution targets individuals that don't have anything, especially when you come from marginalized communities, and we are already ostracized from different sectors of society. So if we're part of groups that the privileged or the majority of society doesn't accept, prostitution is a system that preys on that and says no one else is going to take you, so come, put your boobs up in the camera and let me give you what you need, right? But the reality is it's not you making that choice for yourself, it's your circumstance that made you susceptible. That vulnerability is what is making you a target. That sexual abuse history as a child is what's making you a target. So I just, I can't agree with everybody, and I recognize that everybody's going to have their differences of opinion. But the reality is, whether or not you say you choose to do it, you don't choose to do it, if you check off any of the boxes I listed earlier that make you susceptible to being vulnerable, then you are already a victim of exploitation. You may not identify as a victim, you may not use the savior terminology, the rescue, the this, the that, but the fact that you were exposed to something that is considered abnormal underage, your target just expanded. The target on you, excuse me, expanded. So I recognize that not everybody will see the same thing, but the reality is the sex trade's harms are universal. Doesn't mean sex buyers don't care how you identify, nor do they care what past traumas you've had. So
yeah, and folks can check out Garden of Truth, the prostitution and sex trafficking of Native women in Minnesota. You can Google it. It's on Brenda Hill's site, or her organization's site. And 92% of the 105 women, Native women in Minnesota that we interviewed, some of whom were in what would be legally defined as roughly half were in prostitution, roughly half were in sex trafficking, wanted to get out immediately. So 92% wanted to get out immediately. The 8% that don't want to get out immediately, they're not the problem. Like I don't have any problem with them. They're not the issue. The issue is that 92% want to get out and are unable to do so. There's no issue, there's no political issue in this country that 100% of the people who are a part of X group completely agree with. That's just not true. The big picture is that study after study after study in this country and in other countries show that about 90 to 92% of the people in prostitution and trafficking want to get out immediately. This is an institution, going back to Christopher Columbus, that is going to demand its victims. And it's going to demand people to be used up in these systems. And we see consistently that poverty, homelessness, racism, colonialism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, all of these things, make people more vulnerable to being used. I find the language of rescue and, savior, those are colonial terms. Those are racist terms. They're patronizing. I have never even identified as a victim. I'm clearly a victim. I was a toddler like Beth, used in the same kinds of things that Beth was, until I managed to escape this system when I was an older teenager. I'm clearly a victim. I've never identified as a victim. I have always identified as a survivor. I consider myself to be a fighter, extremely strong. I think I'm quite brave and courageous, and that's how I see other women who identify, or whomever, who identify as survivors, who are being used in these systems. I see them as very intelligent and knowing how to survive. And this rescue stuff, that's got to go to the side as well. But the problem isn't the 8% who are not saying that they want to get out immediately. That's not the issue. The issue is the institutions, the embedded nature of these systems that were brought over here from European countries and implemented onto this land and implemented onto the indigenous people living here. I am Anishinaabe. We do not have a word for prostitution in our language because it did not exist. Women were considered sacred and continue to be considered sacred, and children were gifts from the creators. The by and large indigenous cultures and people that continue to be on this land and that were here then did not view human beings as commodities, and they did not tolerate sexual or physical violence against women and children. Viewing people in those ways is not the only way that human beings have existed. So saying that, well, this has always been like this, or boys will be boys, that's not true. It's just simply not true. It's just a lie to continue and to maintain this system of degradation.
Yes, it is true. And sadly, I need to leave, but I just want to create a space. To be honest, we are not here to tell how people should identify. We are not here to fight, to create friction. We are here to talk about reality. The reality is that we share our stories, we talk about what is happening because we have done the work. We have listened to our communities. I have friends who are on the sex trade already. The reality is that this is more complex than it looks like. So I just want to create that space. There's no need. The reality is that we are fighting systems that are bigger than us. We are fighting patriarchy. We are fighting male sexual entitlement, we are fighting capitalism, we're fighting sexual exploitation. Even that beyond, we have normalized labor exploitation. That's a reality in this world and everywhere in the world. But that doesn't mean that we need to normalize sexual exploitation. We are in this time on human history that we are going to decide, are we going to normalize sexual exploitation as we have normalized labor exploitation? And it's on us. It's on us, like, to decide. The reality is that I share my story. I talk about this. I oppose full decriminalization. I think that prostitution is a system of exploitation because I'm not the only one who was exploited. There were people beyond me. There are people that are being exploited right now, and there are people that are going to continue being exploited. And prostitution is a system that fuels this. Prostitution and all the people that say that this is my choice are the facade that is used to hide all the people that are being exploited, to hide all the people that are being silenced. And this needs to stop. Like, the reality is that there are people who engage on the sex trade that because it's what they want to do, but that's not the majority of people. So I think that if there is a system that is harming our communities, that there is a system that is destroying our bodies, that is a system that is destroying our population, our bodies, and is profiting out of this, and while it's continue oppressing us, I think that it's not the right choice, like you say, this is empowering. That's not the reality. Sadly, that's not the reality. And I'm not uncomfortable when people disagree with me. I really respect that. So, but I just want to say, like, we are not doing this only for me. I'm not overstepping anyone. I am a survivor. I'm just a human being. Like, if that's the reality, I'm not more than anyone. Like, I don't know anything than anyone. I'm talking from my experience, from my experience with my community, from listening to my people, and to acknowledge also my privilege. So, thank you all so much for being here. Like, let's continue having this conversation. This is so important to talk about the realities of sex trafficking, the intersections between prostitution and sex trafficking, and how the commodification of our bodies, the hypersexualization, and the lack of opportunities are driving the sex trade. I'm so happy and honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cristian. And yeah, we're running a little over time. I think we covered most of the things that we brainstormed ahead of time as a group, but not quite all. For those who are still with us, thank you so much. And we didn't get to everything, but we knew we wouldn't because this topic is huge. So this is part of a larger series, and we'll be back each month. And the series, again, is titled The Revolution We Need: Conversations About Sexual Exploitation, Sex Trafficking, and Deep Change. Now we are scheduled, the registration link isn't up yet, but if you'd like to hold your calendars for Friday, April 23rd, we're going to be featuring the work of an organization called Affirm, which has a ton of survivor leadership and was originally organized by Filipino feminists who were working on combating US military prostitution, mail order brides, and the role of United States imperialism in facilitating global sexual exploitation. And the organization has expanded, so it's not only Filipina anymore, they also have a lot of indigenous leadership from the different places where they have chapters. But they've been just an incredible organization bringing together all the things that often seem to be left out, and insisting that anti-exploitation politics have to be feminist and anti-racist, have to be deeply critical of class exploitation and capitalism, and have to really confront globalization and imperialism as root causes, and have to be survivor driven, not just as lip service, but meaning that survivors are setting the agenda. So we're really delighted that the folks from Affirm have agreed to come and have a conversation as part of this series, because they are an incredibly powerful model of what needs to happen. And I hope you'll all come back and hear some of those speakers, including Ninach Garaska and Cara Karolis Jabola and Connie Nguyen. And we'll look forward to seeing you on April 23rd. And after that, join us again in May, likely in May, for a conversation about critical race theory and sexual exploitation. There'll be more coming up about indigenous resistance to sexual exploitation, about LGBT communities, about immigrant and refugee experiences of sexual exploitation, about the question of where prison abolition and sex trade abolitionist politics may intersect, and getting people from those two movements to come and talk to each other. I want to really thank our audience for raising a variety of questions and perspectives in the chat. And there was no way that we could or would try to engage with all of them, but it matters that those dialogues were happening too. And I want to, again, appreciate everybody and hope that you're staying as safe as you're able to during the current incredibly challenging moment. Thank you again for joining us. And the recording link should be sent to those who registered soon. Thanks so much, folks.